Morning, everyone.
Good morning, everyone.
Thank you so much for attending, and it's so nice to see everyone. Would like to introduce our speaker, which is Liban Ahmed. We all know Liban, and he's currently the general manager of SDI.
Yes, guys, my topic today will be about communication. I believe communication is a very important tool in the business that we work. So, for the agenda and the topics that I'll be covering today, we'll talk about the objectives of this session. We're going to be defining the communication and discussing the forms of communication and also the communication process, effective communication and how that looks like. We're going to identify communication barriers, and we can also look at writing effective emails and discussing examples of that. So the objectives of this session, my goal for you, team, is that at the end of this session, you would understand the barriers of communication and understand the different mediums and channels of communication that are there to be used, benefits of effective communication, and the tips for effective communication. These are the 4 points that I would like to touch base on in this session. Defining communication. What does communication mean? Communication is actually a Latin word which means to share. It is the sharing of information between different individuals. That's what the word stands for. I thought it was a nice little info to share with everybody, the definition of the word itself and where it comes from. There are forms and types of communication. A lot of you are aware of it, or like you already practice it and do it, but maybe you haven't seen it in a structured way. So there's the spoken and verbal communication, face to face, telephone, radio, to the television, what we are doing right now, and other media. There's a nonverbal communication, which is usually the body language, gestures, how we dress, how we act, or even the scent. So when you put a perfume, communication happens, guys, when the other person is alerted of something. Like that's communication. So if you're wearing a nice perfume or a very strong perfume and you walk into an elevator and there's someone else there and the two of you standing there, the other person picks up the scent, you're communicating. So that's also considered a communication tool. Writing communication, written communication, sorry, is like, letters, emails, books, magazine, publications, whether it's digital or, like hard copies. Visualization, graphs and charts, maps, logos. These are also communication forms. Now, the process of communication, it's a message or communication is sent when the message or communication is sent by the sender through a communication channel to a receiver or multiple receivers. The sender must encode the message, the information being conveyed, into a form that is appropriate to the communication channel, and the receivers then decodes it, the message, and to understand the meaning of it. So what this tells us, guys, is that you need to understand which medium you're using. If I call you on the phone to discuss about something, the way that I'm going to be discussing or conveying that information will be different in the way that I'm going to be conveying the information in email. Will be, like you have to know which channel you're using first so you can encode the message accordingly. Email communication is different than telephone communication. And guys, these are basic stuff that I'm covering here, but it kind of gives you a little bit of structure in your mind on how this works. So effective communication, how does the effective communication happen? Misunderstanding can occur at any stage of the communication process. So the minute when because always in your brain or in your mind, you have message, something that you want to explain to the other person. And when the message is encoded, and then you use that medium, whether it's telephone, email, whatever the case may be, until it reaches the other person, this is where a lot of the barriers happen and the misunderstandings can happen. Effective communication involves minimizing potential misunderstanding and overcoming any barriers to communication at each stage of the communication process. So when you're communicating to your target audience or the person you want to communicate with, you need to really spend some time in how you encode that message and how you put that information together, because you want to minimize the forth and back. You want to minimize mistakes. And this is really evident in a lot of the work that we do, because especially within DHM, all of us are coming from in different disciplines. Like you have the people who are doing the events, you have the people who are doing the production, you have the people who are doing design. All of them, they have their terms, they have their way of like communicating things quickly and everything. But when cross communication happens, you cannot assume that the way you work with your direct colleague will be also understood by the sister company or by the remote colleague that you have in the organization. So you always have to take into consideration the person who's receiving the information. There's something called a little bit extra on this. It's called, especially when it comes to clients communication, which is a bit outwards, something called kiss or kill, or kiss versus kill. Kiss is keeping it simple, like to the point, and kill is like overdoing it and keeping it lengthy, and like having too much information to get the person very confused. So kiss versus kill is against, especially when it comes to client communication. But internally, what we really need to focus on is understanding the person you're communicating with, and are you being clear enough so you can minimize the misunderstanding that can happen at any stage. An effective communicator understands their audience, chooses an appropriate communication channel, hones their message to this channel, and encodes it to reduce misunderstanding. Now, when you're communicating something, it depends on the information that you want to communicate. Um, there are some stuff that maybe requires a phone call before you recap with email. There's some things that just require a phone call. There's just some things that you can right away start with an email. There's something that require face-to-face communication. You cannot send an email to Jafar asking him for coffee and expect him that he will see that email and get you the coffee there. Like, yes, you communicated it, you used a medium, like you used his email address, but your outcome is not happening. And this is something that really happens a lot in corporations, where people think that, or I call it, they hide behind emails. They think that, okay, I've sent the email, I'm done here, I communicated. No, communication doesn't happen that way. Communication happens when the other person understood what you're talking about. So you need to make sure that person understands the message, that it got there. You sending the email, that's one side communication. It doesn't matter if the responsibility does not leave you unless the other person really understood the message you were trying to communicate. Because ultimately, your goal from this communication is to get something done or to inform someone about something. So if that didn't happen, there's no point of your communication, and you cannot use that as an excuse, especially when it comes to work environment, as an excuse that you have done it. You need to make sure that the other person received the message. Now, if the action didn't happen, that's another case. But your goal here is that message was decoded by the receiver, and they understood exactly what you were asking for or what you were informing them about. They will also seek out feedback from the receivers as to how the message is understood and attempt to correct any misunderstanding or confusion as soon as possible. What you want to avoid is sending something out and not hearing back. Feedback is very important. Not hearing back, for example, you send something and say, okay, the deadline for this is X, Y, and Z time. And then you actually wait all the way until that deadline time comes in without having any check-ins before that or any feedback. If you haven't heard back from the person, that should raise an alarm, or like you should follow up and maybe use another different channel. Pick up the phone and say, hey, did you get my email? Did you understand? Do you have any questions about it? You know what I mean? Or follow up in the same email. So you have to always seek feedback. The responsibility of you communicating and doing your job does not stop only at, oh, I sent the email and that's it, I did my part. The other person did not do your part. No, you have a responsibility in making sure that message is understood by the other person. So this is in a graphical way how it works. So you send a message, you encode it, you use a channel, and the channel, usually you have email, phone call, face-to-face. This is where the barriers happen. Decode it, and then the recipient gives you feedback. He encodes his message, send it back to you, you decode it. Uh, the barriers usually, as you see from this graph, happens in the channel area when the information is being transferred. Communication barriers is overcomplicated, unfamiliar, or technical terms. Now, thanks to Samir Nassif, for the session he did last Thursday and the one he did also in the office before, where we actually got to know a lot of terms and everything. But can you imagine that you have not had that such training or something, then you're working in a production house, and then you send email to someone who does not work in production, and you use terms that are not familiar and expect them to understand. So again, this takes us back to the point I mentioned earlier, which is understanding your audience. You cannot use the same terminology with people who are not from your direct industry, for example, because your goal is to make sure that the message is understood. So you have to break it down a little bit, make it simpler in a way that the other person can understand. Do not overcomplicate, because when you overcomplicate, you're just causing confusion and nobody can take action. Simple, clear. Keep in mind the audience that you're communicating with. Now, differences in perception and viewpoint are usually barriers, and we'll come into. I'll give you examples down the line. Now, perception and viewpoint. Perceptions are usually, I would say, like in my personal opinion, it's one of the main issues when it comes to actually communication barriers. Now, if you and this is, don't get me wrong, guys, it's a very difficult exercise to do, because let's say you have an opinion about someone, or you have an opinion about something. That's already a communication barrier in your mindset. So you're actually not listening to the person. So if a person is known for X, Y, and Z as a reputation, for example, and you get a notification or a message or an email from that person, you're right away thinking about, like, this is what he's trying to do or what she's trying to do. There's that psychological barrier that gives you filter, similar to Instagram, gives you filter on how you're going to read that message. So you're not being objective when you're reading the message. You're making your perception interferes with that, and that sometimes affects the quality of the decoding and understanding what is required. Usually, you might get the same email or the same message from someone else and see it completely different way. But you might get it from someone and you get someone else and you get a completely defensive. You see it differently. You try to justify. Your brain just speeds up. So it's a very difficult discipline to exercise with yourself, to be very objective, to look at the facts the way they are. Physical barriers to non-verbal communications. This usually happens. Sometimes you will get emails and the person doesn't mean anything by it or something, but you will read it differently. Maybe because of the way the sentences are, set together. Maybe the person will sound angry. Maybe the person will sound rude. This usually happens when it comes to written communication because the face-to-face and body language is not there. If the person is right in front of you, and I'm pretty sure all of you have experiences when it comes to, having misunderstandings just because of the way you wrote something, whether it's your family members, whether it's your coworkers, and everything. So you have to take these into mind when physical and body language is not there. Language differences can cause barriers as well. If someone is not fluent in the language you're communicating with them, can create problems in getting the message understood correctly. So that's something you also need to take into consideration when you're communicating. So we have clients, for example, that are superb when it comes to English. We have clients that we know they're like, okay, not very great. So you don't want to confuse them. You need to simplify your English to the maximum, or maybe do not use written communication as a channel to reach out. Use the phone and speak with their own language, because on the phone you can understand from the voice and everything. You can actually get more feedback in what they're whether they're accepting the message you're saying, whether they understood it. It gives you more confidence that your message got across. But sending an email to certain people, you might get feedback with 3-4 words, and it just confuses everybody more. So you need to check, especially when it comes to language, what's the best medium to communicate with that person. Expectations and prejudice may lead to false assumptions. And stereotyping. So that's what I was mentioning earlier. And you also have cultural differences. Cultural differences is something that we've witnessed and seen before, especially when we're a very multinational group of companies and people and everything. We have a lot of nationalities working with us. So everybody's coming from a different culture. You have cultures where they're like straightforward, yada yada yada, done. Khalas. You have culture which is different. For example, Arab culture, you cannot just be dry like that, like, because it comes across rude. But both of these people, none of them was, meaning to be rude, and the other person understood it that it's rude. So then you made a prejudice, and then that person now is being perceived as being rude. So any email that comes from their side in the future will be like, oh yeah, that rude person. So it just rolls over. So it's very good to take time to understand if something comes across in an offensive way, or you do not get it. Pick up the phone, use the other level of communication channel to actually clarify what's going on, so you can understand each other better. And also, you need to understand a little bit of everybody and understand you're working on a multicultural organization. Now we jump to writing effective emails. And guys, if you're writing stuff to me, I cannot see it because I'm in full mode presentation. Writing effective emails. So don't over communicate by email. You don't have to put everything on the email. Like, email is not WhatsApp. It's a great tool, but it's not WhatsApp. So do not over communicate. Use email effectively. Recap. Make sure like everybody's aligned on next steps. Everybody's aligned on the points that were discussed. Use it for sharing information, but do not over communicate by email. We have phones. There's other forms of communication. Make good use of subject lines. Subject lines are very important. Some of us, like, have many emails coming in and everything, and it's very good to see the subject line, so you can mentally you can put time for it, so you can review it. Keep them clear and brief, to the point. Be polite. Check your tone. Read your email. Sometimes it's very difficult, guys, because sometimes you are in different situations, you're in different settings. You're running, maybe, like, to the car, you're going somewhere else, and your email that was sent out might not sound polite. You did not say thank you. So always double check these things. I'm not saying nobody becomes 100% in communication, because communication is always affected by your state of mind, and the situation you're in, which usually translates in the communication and how you do communication. So check, proofread, check your tone, be clear on what needs to be done. Like, use the W's: what, who, where, when. What are we discussing? When do you need it? Like, who is involved? Make it clear, so you avoid a lot of forth and back. Now I'll give you an example of a subject for an email. So you get a subject of email: meeting. Now that's a bad example. A good example would be past process meeting, 10 a.m. February. Yani khalas, I kind of got 50% or 60% of the information from that subject line item. It's another bad example also of writing content for the email. So this email, you can see Monica is sending to Jackie revisions for the sales report. So thanks for sending the report last week. I read it yesterday, and I feel that chapter 2 needs more specific information about our sales figures. I also felt that the tone could be more formal. Also, I wanted to let you know that I've scheduled a meeting with the PR department for this Friday regarding the new ad campaign. It's 11 a.m. and we'll be in the small conference room. Please let me know if you can make that time. What happened in this bad example is that you're mixing things. So you're talking about something and then you jumped into something else, and that subject is deceiving. You have to, your emails, if you're talking about a subject, keep it to that subject. So if you look at the good example: hi Jackie, thanks for sending the report last week. I read it yesterday and I feel the chapter 2 needs more specific information about our sales figure. I also felt that could be formed. Could you amend this? Thanks for the hard work. Done. So the PR that was involved in the email before, that could be a separate email because it's a separate topic. So do not put more than 2 or 3 topics in one place, because it makes it difficult for people to trace it back, or like, to look or to have it for reference, and you confuse the person with such emails. This is another example, and this will show you the power of writing the same information, or requesting the same information, or sharing the same information in 2 different ways. So here in the bad example, we see: Emma, I need your report by 5 p.m. today, or I'll miss my deadline. Harry. Now, another way you could write that is: thanks for all your hard work on the report. Could you please get your version over to me by 5 p.m. so I don't miss my deadline? Thanks so much. There's a big difference between those two. The first one will generate a very defensive behavior from the person you're trying to communicate with, and you got their head out of the objective. So now they're thinking, why are you talking to me like that? So you're putting that person in a different mindset rather than them focusing actually on the topic of the conversation that you have that you want to resolve, which is getting that report by 5 p.m. You put that person in a different mindset right now. So that's, first of all, you're wasting time with people, and first of all, also you're not being polite. But this is a good example to show that you can communicate the same information in a different way that can actually get people to cooperate with you even more. If someone sends me that good example email, I'm gonna get out of my way to make sure I get it done. But the first one, I'll be like, well, let's see, right? So it's always good to be considerate in the way you write emails, and like few adjustments, like you see in this email, can make a big difference for your audience. Now, what's the benefit of communicating correctly and communicating, effectively? You have better job prospects. Why do you have better job prospects? Because when you start communicating effectively, you communicating effectively and connecting. So effective communication can give you the opportunity to connect with people, to connect with your colleagues, to connect with your clients, to connect with your community, your family, whatever the case may be. So when you practice and develop good, effective communication skills, you get better job prospects, because all of our jobs, everything we do is about communicating to someone else. It's about communicating to the client. It's about making a sales pitch. It's about making relationships with your colleagues at work, relationships with your suppliers, relationships with your like community. All of our work is about doing something and then trying to sell it. Now that selling process is about communication skills and being effective in communicating. So the better you get at it, the better prospects you have at work. It advances your career. It increases your efficiency. A lot of forth and back can be really minimized if you communicate effectively with timelines that you have in mind, like having everything in one place to minimize forth and back, to minimize misunderstanding, to minimize all of these things that are caused by communication barriers. You build efficiency. You can get more done if your communication skills are effective. It helps you, team build. It helps you to influence others. And when I say influence, this is not in the negative term. Influence, you can influence someone if you can explain yourself clearly. If someone does not agree with you, or someone disagrees with something or an idea that you have, it could be because you did not explain it very well. So if you're effective in communication and how you encode the message for the audience that you're trying to convince to do something, or to get their buy-in on something, or to get them to understand something, that's what it means by influencing here. If your information is not clear, you're not clarifying, or you're not clear about how you're doing things, or what are you trying to get the other person to agree with you on, then you cannot influence. You cannot influence any decisions. You cannot influence any clients to buy from you. So that effective communication gives you the ability to influence others and build stronger relationships. So now we will go to the Q&A. Thank you very much, guys, for listening. I'll check the chat. Of course, we have the creative team saying that the visualization is the best way to communicate, which is good. Okay, some people said written, some people said verbal, some people said visual. There's no right or wrong, guys, but I think the strongest form of communication is face to face. Now, you may ask why. Visualization is very important. Written is very important. You may ask why I say verbal. Verbal, you can use a lot of other things in one setting. You can use your voice, tone, that's a communication. You can use the way you're dressed. You can use the way you are using your gestures, body language. You have more chances of connecting with the person and influencing them when you use a face-to-face communication. Cecilia, you're right. Yeah, best form of communication depends on the target audience. What I meant in the segment of the forms of communication is the best one that gives you the richer opportunity in terms of communication with another human being. So the face-to-face gives you a lot of stuff, but that does not mean we cannot do face-to-face all the time. So you need to choose your best channel to communicate based on the target audience that you want to reach out to. Can we unmute Jovi? I just want to understand the question.
So what was your greatest challenge and how are you able to, get the receiver what you want to tell about?
To understand. Now, the first thing you want to start with, because you mentioned that you went through all the different channels, right, Jovi? You went, like by written, by spoken, and everything, and still the message is not being received correctly by the receiver, right?
Yes.
I think what we need to understand is what's causing this barrier. Once we understand the barrier being caused, then we can act upon it. So if the barrier is maybe the person doesn't understand the language you're trying to communicate with, you know what I mean? Maybe they're not interested. Maybe they have a prejudice. Maybe they have prejudice, and Nola Jovi is asking me this. There can be once you understand the barrier exactly, you work on fixing that, and that will unblock because the person has a block on their face with one of those barriers. Once you understand which barrier is blocking this information from being absorbed, you can eliminate that, and like get the message across.
I see.
But what you're saying is also correct, Jovi. Like we don't always guarantee that like communication happens correctly, even if you choose the correct channel, even if you choose. There are some stuff that like really not in your hand or the receiver's hand, like the prejudice, the like the psychological setting like within the people communicating. So
Yeah,
that's
I
why I
see.
mentioned in the presentation that it's very important that you try to practice as much as you can, not having prejudice and looking at the information the way it is. Like that will help you. It's not easy. Nobody can do it all the time. It's impossible to do it all the time because you're a human being and you're all of us are built to have prejudice. Prejudice is what helps us. Like you cannot touch a hot iron outside in summer days because you got burnt from it before. You're not stupid enough to do it again. Like your brain is like built and wired that way. So it's very difficult to practice, but you can practice it to minimize. Yes. Cecile, the point that you mentioned is very, very, very important. Listening. And that's a part that I actually did not give a lot of weight now in the presentation you guys saw. So let me start with one thing. Like you have two ears and one mouth for a reason. It's very, very, very important to listen more than you talk, and listen actively. Well, a lot of the times, and again, this is one of the things that you need to train your brain with. A lot of the times you're listening, but you're thinking about something else. The person is talking, and you're like in la la land.
True.
Like so. This really, yeah, this really affects how you absorb the information and how you because you cannot give feedback if you're really not listening. You cannot ask good questions if you're not listening. So listening comes always before talking. Benjamin, yes, 100%. That's why the language of the other person that you're trying to communicate with, if you guys are not using the same language or the language you're using to communicate to that person, and that person is not strong in that language, that could cause a major communication barrier. And the way you can solve that is either by simplifying the language that you're using. Like, don't overcomplicate the language, simplify it, or do not use written. Call him and try to use other indicators of communication being received, such as the tone of voice and everything. You can tell if you speak with someone on the phone if they're confused, if they got your message or not. So maybe that's the best way to communicate with such barriers. Any more question, guys?
How about some people using indirect way of communication? Sometimes you feel ashamed to tell directly to a person.
Yes. So that's a communication barrier, right?
Yeah, sometimes there's something need to say, but you cannot say it directly because it's look like arrogant or it's look like rude. You know?
Exactly. So, no, you're 100%, and that happens on daily basis, Sunny. It was
Yeah.
similar to the example that I've shown in the presentation, where you're asking Emma directly, like, I need this by 5 p.m., like, not to miss the deadline, right? That email, the way it was written, it's that's not that's not a way that I would advise to communicate. Even if you feel like saying that, like, even if your colleague or the person you want to communicate with, you're angry, and you're like trying to tell them to their face that like, hey, there's a deadline, you need to get this done. You know what I mean? We don't use that language. If we just tweak it a little bit, like he said, in a different way, you can ignite cooperation from the other person. So I know a lot of the times, and this also again connects to the cultural differences. You might have some people who like to communicate directly, short like that, and that will ignite the other person's. Okay, you're being rude, and then you have other persons who do not like, and they're being too polite that they cannot actually tell you, hey, I have a deadline. Can you please do this for me today? They're shy even from asking that. So you really need to find that middle ground, and how to communicate that message to the person. Then yes, you're right for the emotional response. So a lot of times you might get an email, or you might get an email from a client or communication that happened, and you get um, upset. Like it pisses you off and everything. Never communicate while you're under that kind of influence at all. When you're under the influence of emotions, do not communicate, because you will cause more damage than fixing or addressing the issue. Give your time some time. Give yourself some time. Absorb the information, and then respond back objectively. Because what happens when you're under emotional, condition because of the communication you receive, right away, that's the biggest communication barrier. There, you're not thinking straight. You have, you have a filter that was created by the emotions from you reading that email. Give it some time, think it over, and then respond objectively, and try to be objective. Try to be objective as much as possible. Mu'taz, you're right. Yeah, when body language is missing, sometimes that's a major challenge when it comes to written communication, and body language just amplifies what you're trying to say. Cecile, again, 100%. You have to be honest in your communication, guys. You have to be sincere in your communication. Don't be polite, but do not take out information. Be clear. Do not leave out information. Be clear and honest with the person you're communicating with. This will help you even build a good rapport with the person and a better relationships, let's say, if you follow that way. Got a good question from Mazen. So Mazen's asking, would there be any preference for some kind of communication when it comes to colleagues within one team, verbal or writing, or an example? It's a great topic indeed. Thank you very much, Mazen. So like I said, this always goes back to your target audience. When you're communicating with your team, it can be done either way. It can be done either way. What dictates that is the kind of message that you're trying to send. That message could be done by email. It could be done by face to face. It depends. If you're trying to build a team building event, for example, of course you cannot do that by email. You need to have face to face conversation with the team members. But always the channel is dictated by the kind of message and the audience that you are after. That will determine what kind of channel you would use for the most effective way of getting that message across to the people. If your communication or your objective is to make people feel warm and togetherness and everything, you do it face to face. Similar to how we're doing it now. I mean, we're doing it over Microsoft Teams, but we're doing it face to face. We're collaborating, we're communicating face to face, which gives you the sense of collaboration and everything, and that we're all on this together. That was the objective, right? So you reach it that way. If you use email, you need to understand what message you're trying to send to your team. So yeah, I hope I answered your question, Mazen. Faye, I think why do you think writing all caps and written is different meaning? So it's funny, but this is also a prejudice, right? We're used to, when we're using our social media communications, that you try to portray that you're yelling or you're overexcited by using caps. That's why we do not recommend using caps in emails, because you come across as if you're yelling at the person. Um, so I'm pretty sure everybody knows this, but it's just, just to say, caps are not preferred in emails. It does come across as if you're yelling. Yes, exclamation marks and punctuations, guys, are very important, because that really changes the tone of your message. Like where you're stopping with the sentence. Like how often you're using the exclamation mark. Exclamation mark can also come across as yelling, or you're way too excited. Just sometimes it doesn't make any sense when you have so many exclamation marks in your email. For example, you can have at the end of the email, "Thanks!" exclamation mark. Yeah, okay, that works. But you cannot have exclamation marks everywhere. Dear thanks, hi, like it's gonna be just too much in an email, like. I think emoticons are fine, Sunny, depending on who you are communicating with. If you communicate with a client that sees this as not a professional, you might create a communication barrier. But some clients, they actually use emoticons. So it depends on your target audience. At the end of the day, your goal is to deliver a message that the other person understands, whether it's done with emoticons, whether it's done like with other ways of communication. Your end goal is the channel, is the audience understanding your message. Once that is clarified and very clear, that will dictate the kind of channel you use. If there's no questions, I really hope that you found it beneficial. Um, it was very basic, it's very high level, but sometimes, like we just need to go back to the basics to understand and refresh ourselves on certain topics. So I hope I've been of service and help to you guys today. You can reach out to me separately after this by email, by phone call. If you have any questions and anything I can help you out with, I'm more than ready. Thank you very much, guys.